When people are often watching a movie, the film score is oftentimes an afterthought, with the occasional memorable theme or epic action sequence. But when film scoring, the timbre, or the color tone of an instrument, leaves the viewer with a subtle emotional connection. Two instruments may play the same exact melody with the same dynamics, but your perception of them may be the complete opposite. John Williams once said, "Writing a tune is like sculpting. You get 4 or 5 notes, you take one out and move one around, and you do a bit more, and eventually, as the sculptor says, in that rock there is a statue. We have to go find it." When fans were first viewing Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, and more specifically The Fellowship of the Ring, there was high praise for the realistic set building, faithful acting, or the otherworldly CGI. However, contrarily, this is what Peter Jackson himself has to say about the music, specifically for Fellowship of the Ring.
The music score on any film is obviously vitally important because it totally guides your emotions when you're watching the film. I mean, the actors can do their job, the director can do their job in terms of creating a certain amount of mood and emotion, but obviously music is like so strong in evoking what you should be feeling at any given time.
This rhetoric can be felt in the literal first seconds of the film, as before we as an audience are ever introduced to Frodo or Mordor, we hear Middle-earth. Ritualistic chants far in the distance loom over a dark screen for the first 5 seconds of the film. Howard Shore's score for all 3 Lord of the Rings films was not the cherry on top, but the linguistic foundation for the films. However, once again, how could you tell what you were hearing was a voice, not a cello or a flute? In this video essay, we will indulge in this topic. Not only the psychological science behind how our ears and minds are able to decipher instrumental tone, but also changing notable themes from the films in an attempt to see how our emotional connection to the themes changes with the timbre. Let's begin with some basics. Timbre is the element of sound that allows us to distinguish the difference between a piano and a trumpet, even if they're playing the same note at the same volume or dynamic. According to Dr. Stephen McAdams, a research scientist for the CRNS and professor at McGill University, quote, "The term timbre refers to a set of perceptual attributes that listeners use to discriminate different sound sources in addition to pitch, loudness, duration, and spatial position. In other words, timbre is a set of musical characteristics that psychologically links our ears to instruments, regardless of pitch, dynamic, or length." It should be mentioned, however, that all of these characteristics are contributors to that theory, but timbre is the ultimate distinguisher. In addition, we know that specific timbres can lead to inherent emotional responses, where brighter timbres incite happier emotions and darker timbres incite fear or anger. This can be seen further with the 2009 study published in the National Library of Medicine by Julia C. Hailstone, titled, quote, "It's not what you play, it's how you play it. Timbre affects perception of emotion in music." In the study, volunteers who claimed to be healthy and had no symptoms of cognitive nor hearing illnesses were subjected to 4 different melodies, which were in an attempt to provoke a specific emotion to the listener when subjected. 80 total melodies were played to the volunteers, and of which 20 of them were supposed to be sad, 20 were supposed to be happy, 20 being angry, and 20 being fearful. In the results of the experiment, quote, "There was a statistically significant interaction between instrument and emotion judgment," followed by, quote, "For happy melodies, the odds of an intended response were lower for the violin than for other instruments, while for sad melodies, the odds of an intended response were lower for the synthesizer than for other instruments. This figure was also provided." When analyzing this data alongside the table, it is clear that among both older and younger volunteers, there's a clear correlation between instrumentation and emotional attachment. Therefore, the conclusion can be drawn that not only can an individual, regardless of musical experience or age, be not only able to interpret specific instrumentations, but use a specific instrument's timbre to connect it with a specific emotion. Therefore, using this research, it can be assumed that consciously or unconsciously, composers must also choose to compose a melody or motif using a specific instrument or series of instruments. So let's move back to Lord of the Rings, and since we could unfortunately not secure an interview with Mr. Shore himself, we're going to have to improvise. On August 26, 2020, Howard Shore sat down on Score, the podcast, hosted by Robert Kraft and Kenny Holmes, to discuss the Lord of the Rings films. When speaking about the instrumentation, he claimed,
maybe people hadn't read the book, who were seeing the film. Who are these people? How do they differ? Why are these elves different than the Lothlorien elves and the Rivendell elves? Or these men are different than these men? So the music became thematic as a way to express clarity to tell the story.
As stated by Shore himself, the music for Lord of the Rings became one of the primary ways for virgin audiences to understand the differences between races, places, and faces. Shore's comment therefore makes it seem like the instrumentation for specific themes and characters was specific, and one of the main reasons many motifs have slight sequencing, or the changing of a motif by rearranging the pitch, rhythm, or dynamic, but oftentimes they stay distinguishable to the audience. Take this motif, arguably the most recognizable of the entire series of movies. And again here. Despite the literal notes being different, as the second sequence takes place a major second down, the listener can very clearly still tell this is the same motif. The theme is played typically, but not always, when referring to the Fellowship as a collective or in fragmented pieces, such as individual characters. However, would it still be distinguishable if it was played on a tuba? When the melody, specifically the line above the harmonic chords, is transposed from a horn to a tuba, did it sound different to your ears emotionally? Did it by chance sound more romantic, mysterious, or calm? These emotional reactions would all be rational according to a study published by ResearchGate titled, quote, "The Emotional Characteristics of Brass Musical Instruments with Different Pitch and Dynamics," and presented at the 2019 International Computer Music Conference, in which 66 participants were subjected to a listening test where they had to put 30 different combinations of pitches, dynamics, and instruments, and match them to an emotion. In comparison to the last study, this one focused entirely on brass timbre, being tuba, horn, trumpet, and trombone. Their findings, specifically in comparing different brass timbres, can be seen with this provided dataset. As seen by the chart, our ears should have changed our connotation of the motif from specifically heroic or scary to romantic or mysterious. Now that you have this information, hear the original with the French horn, and the one with tuba. Still not convinced? Take another theme from Howard Shore's score, titled The Fighting Uruk-hai. For those unaware of who the Uruk-hai are, take this quote from Gandalf. "There are orcs, very many of them," he said, "and some are large and evil, black Uruks of Mordor. For the moment they are hanging back, but there is something else there." In other words, they are super orcs, or described by the Tolkien Gateway, the Uruk-hai were speculated by Treebeard to have been either men who Saruman ruined, or created as hybrids of orc and men. Due to their larger size and resistance to sunlight, Treebeard called this possible crossbreeding a black evil. Howard Shore's score reflects this rhetoric, as the piece begins with the metallic ostinato in the percussion section, with layered chords spelled out in the brass, specifically the French horns. Take a listen. Now take it and replace the horns with the grand piano. As explained earlier with the Hailstone study, the emotions of anger and fear should be less receptive than with the original horns. Hear the ostinato again. And the piano. As you can hear, the melody should be a little less intense and angry and a little more mellow, even happier or sadder. For one final example, take hobbits. The Tolkien Gateway has this about hobbit culture. Quote, "Shire hobbits called everyone else outsiders. Due to living in the Shire hobbits were largely sheltered from the rest of Middle-earth and did not know or pay attention to what was going on outside of the Shire. The thought of the great sea far in the west filled them with awe and curiosity and was always part of their imagination. But by the end of the Third Age it turned into fear, parallel to distrust of all elvish lore, and this mood remained even after the War of the Ring." To me, hobbit culture, specifically in the Shire, is all about carefreeness, living in the comforts of one's hobbit hole, drinking many ales and smoking much pipeweed, living in blissful, carefree happiness. The theme, The Shire, by Howard Shore reflects this, starting off with a string melody over harmonic chords, followed by string and bassoon. The fiddle melody is extremely recognizable, and from research previously stated from Hailstone, we know the violin is very happy-sounding timbre. Let's take a listen. However, what if we changed the fiddle theme to a trombone, or a string timbre to a low brass timbre? Once again, the original. and the trombone. To you, your emotional connection should have felt a little less happy and carefree and more shy or sad. However, ultimately it is up to you as the individual listener to see if the theme's connotation changes or not. Research aside, there are a multitude of factors at play more than timbre, and someone may already have a mental or emotional connection to a theme, so even when it changed, it may still have the same attachment. To reiterate, in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, specifically The Fellowship of the Ring, he uses music, and specifically Howard Shore's Grammy Award-winning album with the same name, to enhance the world on screen and make the viewer imagine they are truly living in Middle-earth alongside the hobbits and wizards. However, there has to be a reason that specific instrumentation was presented with specific characters or moments in the plot. The main element at play when deciphering why specific instruments were chosen is timbre, or the element of sound that allows us to distinguish the difference between a piano and a trumpet, even if they're playing the same note at the same volume or dynamic. Hopefully in this video you were able to hear the differences between specific melodies or themes being played on specific instruments. And if so, do you feel emotionally different about said themes? Do you think that if those specific instruments were chosen, the connotations on screen would be at all different? Think about it, and thank you for watching.